Namaste and welcome to Urban Chatterati. This is Abhinav Prakash. And today I have with me Abhijit Iyer-Mitra to discuss the recent developments in France. We have seen how the President Macron and the France have waged war against what they call Islamo-leftism. So we're going to discuss what Islamo-leftism is and what is the future of this new war against this new entity. So Abhijit, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me as usual, Abhinav.
So, Abhijit, when we talk about Islamo-leftism, what does it actually mean?
So, look, Islamo-leftism has had a long history, right? It's this, how socialists try to construct this rainbow coalition of oppression. It doesn't matter if you're oppressed or not. In their view, if you're not one of the haves, you are oppressed. Okay, your mental faculties or your laziness have nothing to do with it. You're just oppressed. So what happens is that for a very long time, we've seen socialists and leftists constantly latch on to this thing of these movements of Islamism from a very early period of time, right? So you would see the Chinese Communist Party, for example, the CPSU, the Communist Party of the USSR, for example, always used to talk about oppressed minorities, minority rights. We're going to make it a secular state. When the communists came to power in Nepal, even though Nepal has a negligible Muslim population, they've never actually complained of persecution or oppression. The communists consider them to be oppressed just by virtue of living in a Hindu state, right? So this has been a very long attempt by them to mobilize the Islamists as a political force. The problem, of course, is the Islamists hate nothing more than godless communists. Because if you remember, the whole reason that they went in to protect Afghanistan, almost the entire Muslim world mobilized, was that there was nothing that they would, had it been a Christian country invading Afghanistan, they would have been fine. Their problem was a communist country invading Afghanistan, right? So what happens is that invariably, what happens is this relationship, it's one of mutual convenience. And it usually reaches its endpoint when one or the other get to power, right? So for example, wherever Islamist movements have come to power, the first people they target for execution are communists. And wherever communists come to power, the first people they target for execution are religious leaders. And to be fair to them, they are completely religiously neutral about which religious leaders they execute. So you see, for example, how the Chechen revolt started up under the Russian Empire, when the Soviets had, when it had just transitioned from the Russian Empire to the Soviets. You saw again a result of a lot of the, so-called love of Islam, that they introduced all these clauses in the USSR constitution guaranteeing protection of religion. But, I remember going to Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan and things in 85. If you had so much as gone to a mosque more than once a month, the KGB would be knocking on your door. In fact, they'd knock on your door if you even went to a mosque, right? In China, what's happening, I don't even need to tell you, even though freedom of religion is guaranteed in the constitution and things like that. It's a perpetual trend. But I particularly enjoy this alliance because these are two toxic tribes that deserve each other. Communists deserve Islamists and Islamists deserve communists, and they both deserve what they get when the other comes to power. You look at what happens even in India.
China and Pakistan deserve each other.
Exactly. So, which is a classic example, communist state and Islamist state. Take a very interesting example. The main vote bank of the communists in Bengal was Muslims, right? And the moment they came into a comfortable-ish majority, they transitioned to something like Mamata Banerjee. So they will always use you and dump you when required, which is smart. That shows you that the Muslim population as a whole doesn't think the way Islamists think, right? But now what you have is Islamists have tagged on. Islamists using the Muslim vote bank, you have to separate the two, tag on to Mamta. And now because of the BJP threat, they're kind of doubling down. And with Asaduddin Owaisi coming, they don't know what to do.
Yeah, yeah,
So it's one of those wondrous things where, the COM is caught up in a dilemma, but both know in private that the actual worst enemy is each other.
yeah. So Islamo-leftism is something which infect Indian universities as well. I have seen that in JNU very closely, how all these comrades will be abusing Hinduism day in and day night, but they will be reciting all those Islamist iconoclastic poems, iconoclast imagery, and they had. I mean, it was very normal for them to praise Islam and the Muslims. The more orthodox Muslim you are, the greater comrade you are, and if you as much if just go to a celebration for free prasad in a Durga Puja, then you are a communal fast sangi. So this is something which we see in India as well. But coming to the France.
Talking about JNU, look at Umar Khalid, alleged atheist. Turns out he's not an atheist at all, and his father was a Simi activist, wasn't he? Something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
Some band organization activist. This just gets funnier by the minute. It's actually, if they weren't so dangerous, it would actually be a Punch and Judy clown show watching them.
Yeah, yeah. But coming to the France, as to what is happening in the France, Abhijit, that the government itself is now going after it. So they have literally declared war against Islamo-leftism. What's happening? What pushed the France to that? To doing those things, because France is supposedly just this secular country which doesn't care about it, doesn't even count the people on the basis of the religion and ethnicity and so on.
Yeah. So look, France has, when we say secular, we need to differentiate between the kinds of secularism, right? The French Revolution that brought in secularism, it was called laïcité, and it was very, very anti-clerical. Any religion bad, go after it, right? And so brutal separation of church and state, which can be temple and state, mosque and state, synagogue and state, what have you. Similarly, if you look at American secularism, it started off because you had a bunch of religious loonies who were too lunatic even for Britain in the 1500s, who land up in the Americas. And for them, it's about the protection of loonyism. So, the protection of faith is the basis of American secularism, which is completely opposite to what France thinks on that score. In India, it's more similar to the American model because we are dharma nirpeksh. You allow religions to flourish, but you don't separate them. It's just that you don't pick and choose which to be, you don't play favorites. So you have three different versions. Now, if you come to the uh, um, French version, they have successfully removed synagogue and state, temple and state, and uh, especially church and state. The one people that constantly resist, because an Islamist polity cannot have the mosque and state ever separated. It isn't allowed because it's a fundamentally political religion from its inception. It was always a religion of power. It wasn't, the religion of opposition that Christianity grew up as. So, which is why you'll see a lot of Christian pastors and things support protest movements, anti-government movements. Even in Christian states, they don't hesitate to do it, right? But Muslims, as a rule, won't, because it's always been a religion of power. So mentally, they've never been able to separate it. Unfortunately, what happens in France is, unlike, say, the Vietnamese or the Pondicherry folks and things like that, who integrated completely into society, the North Africans and people like that have not been able to integrate into society. And normally when that happens, you tend to look for excuses. Like wokes tend to look for privilege and whatnot as an excuse for their own failure and their inability to take a bath or brush their teeth or whatever. They invariably, and they never want to blame their own parents for it, of course, or themselves. So they will look for some other excuse. And so what happens in France is they look to Islam for solace. They look to Islam for political power, which is simply not allowed. And like all socialist communists in every other country, this is a gripe that is constantly exploited by the left in France.
Hmm.
Nothing new. To be fair, the socialists did not, but the far left has been. France has been the capital of the intellectual rot that spurned wokeism ultimately. Though the French never went down that particular woke path in that sense. You'll never see Macron ask for people's pronouns or use pronouns on his own Twitter profile, will you? So, the French that way is one of those curious things because they're insulated from social media. You won't see Facebook becoming a story. You won't really see Twitter becoming a big story out there. That polarization, the end of the center hasn't ever really happened in France as badly as it has. It has, but it's just never been as bad as the rest of the world.
Yeah, but then also they're taking it so seriously. You see that the French education minister is repeatedly saying that we have to fight against this garbage coming from the American universities. And no, being at in India, we are more threatened by this kind of garbage because we are the part of the Anglosphere. And this
Right.
garbage is coming to India. We're seeing that people writing Hinduism is a false religion, Hindus are a fake people, all this kind of thing, but there's no pushback at the government level, at the intellectual level. Do we even have the capacity to understand the threat which is coming from the American universities, which are now under complete control of this woke, crazy woke people?
So remember, the Indian right isn't exactly a smart bunch of people, right? Unfortunately, the general IQ seems to be quite low. Uh, so what ends up happening is that in France, you have a sequence of events. First, the French ambassador to Washington, D.C., attacks the New York Times and Washington Post.
Yes.
Then the French minister says we need to stop the trash coming in from American universities. And then it escalates to the point where the home minister, on a debate with Marine Le Pen, the
Hmm.
so-called far right uh, alleged racist bigot, says she has not gone strong enough on Islamo-leftists. And it is the so-called far right Marine Le Pen who falls back on individual liberties. She says, individual liberties can't be trampled upon. So isn't it amazing that we're seeing what? Yeah. So remember, Macron served in a socialist cabinet. He may be a centrist, but he served under François Hollande as his economics minister.
And Macron, when he was elected, all the vokes and the liberals in India celebrated that when will India have its own Macron?
Comeuppance. But what Macron does, and what they have the legitimacy to do, is what no right-wing government can ever gain the legitimacy to do. Right? So even attacking US universities, attacking woke culture that the French cabinet does. The second thing we should remember is France is very, very clear on first principles. If you look at the way legislation is thought out and done carefully, it is actually very, very clearly thought out. There are multiple layers of referencing. So do you remember the time when Sikhs in India got very upset with the French for banning the pagdi?
Yeah.
Right. And the French were very clear, boss, we respect your religion. Okay. There are 5 signs of your religion. Uh, Kadha, Kirpan, Kacha, Kesh, Kanga. We're not banning the others. You can have a ceremonial dagger as long as it's not sharp and things like that, so on and so forth. But where does it say pagdi?
Hmm.
Okay, so feel free to wear your hair open. Now, what people then realize is that the compulsory wearing of the pagdi actually comes from the Rehat Maryada,
Yes.
which is a later text which then codifies it because there was too much syncretism between Hindus and Sikhs. One of the ways in which, say, for example, of course, the Master Tara Singh deal with the British to keep Sikhs as a separate qom from the Hindu qom is well known. And of course, the Arya Samaj's own clumsiness in that regard of dividing Hindus and Sikhs is also well known. But as a part of this entire thing of the focus on the pagdi came about, right? Which everybody in India knows is not a religious sign, but for the Sikhs, it ends up becoming a religious sign. So the French were very clear. We will let you do what is mandated in your religion, but don't come up with all these additions, everything that you want to add on later on. None of that. Okay. So no burqa. And because they are what applies to men applies to women. If women are not allowed to wear the burqa, men also aren't allowed to go with complete facial coverings or uh, hair coverings and things like that. So they've been very, very clear about it, and it works very well. So one of the reasons, so what happens is, on the one hand, the angles for attack on France are very minimal unless you make a fool of yourself in public. Unlike India, which doesn't think through legislation, so it can be attacked fairly easily, number one. Number two, the French are an extremely self-confident people. In India, on the other hand, we have this extraordinary inferiority complex, especially when it comes to the white man, where we're either too diffident or we're too supine.
Aggressive. Yeah.
Yeah. So
So,
there's never a rational comeback. It's always supinity or diffidence.
mhm. But you mentioned this thing that France is actually has been the origin of this wokeism because French philosophers and thinkers, uh, uh, some of them are outright vandals, So this entire thing, the concept of original affluent society, that tribal societies were the best, industrialization destroyed everything, agriculture is oppressive, all those crazy ideas in a more sophisticated academic language originates from France, but somehow French did not fall for it as a polity, but Americans did, and now India is falling to that nonsense. So why did that happen?
The French are very smart people. They don't drink their own Kool-Aid. Uh, they're the kind of people that produce a lot of drugs only for export market. So if you take a Breaking Bad analogy, they're one of the world's biggest producers of crack crystal, which is entirely for the export market. If you try to peddle it within France, it'll be the guillotine for you. So it's kind of like that. The French have never realistically fallen for it, though there was that other dunce of a so-called intellectual, what, Henri Bernard Levy or something like that, who was calling for, he was one of the biggest supporters of regime change in Libya, and then again in Syria as well. And after what happened in Libya and the complete breakdown of that society, he hasn't shown his face around much in Paris. And usually I've heard that apparently if he walks around, people spit at him and things like that. So he's since kept a very low key. He hasn't been showing his face around. And that is how the French have a seriously good accountability matrix.
Hmm.
If you get it wrong, you're screwed.
Hmm. But can the French roll back this Islamo-leftism from the university campuses? Because
Yes.
that will
I think
require a lot of deconstruction of the academic literature produced in the last 20, 30 years.
it will. And this is where, the insularity of the French and they've been crystal clear about the founding principles of the French state. Crystal clear. And this is where you need to have that intellectual clarity. You need to have that conceptual clarity. They're very good at theory. They're very good at concepts. And this is why if the pushback against wokery and Islamo-leftism comes, it is going to come from France.
Uh, but let's say, the French minister is now, and the French government is saying we're going to sweep the universities for this wokeism and Islamo-leftism. Is that not an academic witch hunt? Will that not destroy the free thinking in the universities? Will that not have severe side effects, which will, create lots of backlash? Because many young people will then join this Islamo-leftism just to oppose what the state is doing.
Yes and no. And I'll tell you why. Yes, because there will be some kind of a backlash. But remember, Europeans aren't as free thinking as they'd like to believe. They too behave like a Mexican wave and go in for whatever notion is most prevalent across the world. So when Nazism was in fashion, they were all Nazis. When extreme nationalism was the fashion in Britain and France, they were all extreme nationalists. When Christian evangelism was the vogue in the late 1800s and early 1900s, they used to be extreme evangelists, right? When you look at climate change activism, which has now become a religion in itself, They're all extreme climate change evangelists, to the point that when Angela Merkel decides no more nuclear,
Ah,
even though nuclear is one of the most tangible green energies in that sense, the whole of Germany goes, yeah, 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 no more nuclear, green energy kind of thing. So they are zombies in a sense. Europeans, despite all the intellectual evolution and everything, do tend to behave like zombies because remember, there is a high trust factor between the state and the citizen because the state very sparingly abuses its prerogatives and privileges. Unlike in India, where state to citizen trust is almost non existent because of constant abuse of those privileges, in Europe, it's a function of trust
hmm,
as well. So it's zombieism plus trust that comes together.
hmm.
So you will see a sort of intellectual backlash, but knowing Europe, it won't translate. Now, will innocent people get caught up? Unfortunately, yes. But the issue is how many innocent people have got up in the wokeism and things like that category.
I
I
think
think
so. Yeah.
between a re-establishment of state power and injustices on the woke, I would any day be on the side of a re-establishment of state power, no matter what the cost to the woke.
That I
Uh,
agree.
and and I also want to point out France has succeeded in this thing. This is not the first time that they've said that they're going to clean out the universities. In the early 2000s, I think, when Sarkozy was still home minister under Chirac, uh, and the Paris riots broke out, Sarkozy was the one that came up and said, we are going to hose these banlieues with karchers. So banlieues are these ugly, low-income, high-rise suburbs of France, which is where all the riots were happening, right? And a karcher is a high-pressure steam water hose. It's what's used for professional cleaning. So imagine for him to say we are going to clean out, and he used the term rakaye. Rakaye means scum. So imagine a home minister who then became president coming and saying, I am going to clean out the scum with high pressure steam cleaners from low income, mostly Algerian colonies, suburbs, whatever you want to call it. And very curiously, there is a high correlation between the amount of suburbs that Corbusier designed and riots taking place. Because
Hmm.
in France, nobody except the dirt poor wanted to live in Corbusier's hideous designs. And apparently, Corbusier's hideous designs caused the highest amount of drug addiction and depression, which may explain the drug problem in Punjab as well.
But Abhijit, coming
And
to
he succeeded. He succeeded. You haven't had riots there in that ever since. Even though the so-called underlying causes remain, it hasn't happened there ever since.
maybe because in France the left and right they have a consensus. Let's say broadly speaking, opposition parties have a consensus on the fundamental values. Unlike in India, where you're more than willing to peddle Pakistani wartime propaganda during Balakot or praise China to the skies when the Galwan clash is happening. So I don't think we see that. At least not the main opposition parties are doing that kind of behavior. Is it right?
Yes, that is one of the blessings of being non-Anglophone.
Hmm.
If you look non-Anglophone social media countries, the fraying of the center isn't so great. You look at Germans, most Germans, right or left, broadly agree. I mean, they will try to show it as severe differences. The left has severe differences with Angela Merkel. They'll be talking about like things like should it be 100 windmills or 1,000 windmills kind of thing. They don't fundamentally disagree on windmills, even though I have serious issues with windmills. I think anybody sane should have serious issues with windmills. But the same in Italy. There's a cacophony. Italian politics tends to be very loud, very uh, rambunctious and riotous, but they all get along.
Hmm.
It's the same in France, pretty much, right? Even though you had a bitter campaign, imagine Macron outwriting uh, Marine Le Pen, right? So what you see is a very Anglophone breakdown.
Hmm.
and in societies that are influenced by the Anglophone.
The
So in
part
India,
of the
what happens
Anglosphere.
is, the vernacular is so deeply in, and I call it vernacular for a reason. I know it's considered a derogatory, but I will continue to use it. You know why? Because they constantly look to English editors, English newspapers, and English awards and English press for validation. For them,
Agree.
it is English press validation that counts over anything else. That same thing gets translated and mirrored into society. And this also, this you will see this become bigger and bigger. And this is why, we suffer from all the negatives of being an Anglophone society with none of the positives of it.
Mm, mm. But the Macron has now emerged as the only Western leader who is fighting for the West, the fundamental values which define the West.
Yeah.
Do you see this fight spreading to other countries as well? Will
No,
say, look at the UK and America. Their elites, their political leaders have completely surrendered to the
they have.
mob, and they have no
For
guts
example,
to say anything.
absolutely. Boris Johnson, for example, does not say anything. The BBC has turned into a complete woke madhouse under him. He's doing nothing about it. There's no pushback in Australia. There's no pushback in uh, America, especially. Well, in America there is, but in the UK there is no real pushback, politically at least. Germany, there's no pushback against. In fact, the right there is so far left, it's not even funny. Which is why I think France will lead the world. Remember, France has led the world for such a small country. It's led the world very, very often in lots of things,
Hmm.
be it fraternity, liberty, equality, things like that, and getting rid of a tyrannical government. So there's a lot of rot that has come from France, but there's also been a lot of good that has come from France.
Yeah. Yeah, so because French is spoken in a large part of the world, so we hope that what the France is doing today, that will also spread to the countries which are linked to the France. Just like the rot coming from America is spreading to India because we are the part of the Anglosphere. So at least in the French-speaking countries in Africa and other places, perhaps we will see a balance being restored in the world.
I doubt the Francophone is going to follow because most of the Francophones in Africa
Hmm.
who stand to significantly benefit from this kind of privilege and post-structuralist discourse that you see.
Yeah, but
So
most of them are not either Islamic or communist countries.
they are not. They are not. And in fact, what most of them have a very, let's just say, have a very Catholic, and I mean, I don't mean Catholic in the sense of their general descriptor. I mean a very Catholic church view of social liberalism.
Hmm. So thank you, Vijit, for this insight, and we will keenly watch what is happening in the France, and we wish the French people and the President Macron best of luck in his fight against Islamo-leftism and wokeism. Thank you. Please do not forget to subscribe and join the channel, and please press the bell icon. I always forget to say it, but I'm saying it and forcing myself to be more particular about it so that you can receive the notifications for the new videos, especially when Abhijit is on the show. So thank you, audience, and thank you.
जय मैक्रोन, देश का नेता कैसा हो, मैक्रोन जैसा हो.